Welcome back to another episode of Revealed Apologetics. I'm your host, Eli Ayala, and today I am excited to have Brian Knapp on. And Brian Knapp was a co-founder of Choosing Hats. So if anyone is familiar with presuppositional apologetics, back in the day, there was this super cool website, and actually it's still around, where they had some really good presuppositional material that went a little beyond kind of the popular level, very surfacey way of using Presup. There was some depth there that I really appreciated, and some really good writing, especially from Chris Bolt, who I had on, I think twice in a couple of past episodes. And so I'm excited to have Brian Knapp here, who is a co-founder of Choosing Hats, and he's a pretty bright guy, an awesome guy, and he's become a recent friend of mine, and hopefully we can have a great conversation in today's episode. But before we do that, I just want to make a couple of announcements by way of future guests. On the 26th, I do apologize if that's the wrong date, don't have it in front of me, but I think it's 26th. I'll be having Michael Preciado, who is the author of the book A Reformed View of Free Will. He's a Calvinist philosopher, a very sharp guy. We're going to have him on to talk about free will. I know a lot of people are interested in those sorts of discussions. And I also am going to have on a woman who caught my attention by an article she wrote. Her name is Scarlett Clay. And she wrote an article talking about her experience at Biola University, taking an apologetics course there, and how apologetics was taught at Biola University. She wrote an article as to how that kind of led her to presuppositional apologetics. Now, if you know anything about Biola, Biola is really the center of gravity for Biola is apologetics from a classical approach, an evidential approach. And so it's kind of a strange thing to hear someone say they went to Biola, took an apologetics course there, and was drawn to presuppositional apologetics. So when I read that article, I was like, that would be an awesome thing to get this woman on and share her story, because I think it's very interesting, because her story centers on the God-centeredness of presuppositionalism, which she found when she learned about it. She kind of was drawn to that idea, and what appeared to be kind of a drawing away of a God-centered approach to apologetics in the classical approach. Now, granted, that it also depends on the person too, how they present their apologetic, or what have you. But I thought her story was really interesting. So we'll be having her on in May. And of course, everyone knows I like to play fair. Okay, I'm a hardcore presuppositionalist, but I do like to get our evidentialist and classical brothers on. So on May 3rd, I'll be having Dr. Michael Licona on to talk about evidence for the resurrection, which, by the way, is important for presuppositionalists to know. You don't get away with simply saying by what standard. That is a perfectly valid thing to say, a thing to ask. But you do need to know the ins and the outs of the Christian faith too. And I think knowing the evidence for the resurrection is very important. So hopefully Dr. Michael Licona will be very helpful in that regard, as he is highly studied in that specific area. Okay. And again, for those hardcore purist presuppositionalists, yes, you don't have to private message me about the areas in which, you disagree with Dr. Licona. Yes, we don't agree on everything. We don't agree on epistemological issues. We don't even agree as to how you interpret evidence and things like that. But that being said, I do think he has a lot of helpful things to say. And so I'm having him on for, so that I could learn, and also for your benefit. If you're wondering how to gather the facts and make an argument for the resurrection, perhaps we can take what an evidentialist or a classicalist, I would say Michael Licona is an evidentialist, but don't quote me. How can we take the hard work of our evidentialist brothers, whom we disagree with in their apologetic methodology? How do we take that important information and contextualize it within a consistent presuppositional framework? I think that's fair game if we want to be consistently presuppositional and deal with evidences. So it's not an either or situation. So looking forward to having Dr. Michael Licona on. And so I'll let you guys know when I have some other guests. I kind of wing it. I'll be flipping through Facebook and like, I might want to have that person on. So I'll keep you guys updated. But all that aside, just one more thing, and then we'll invite Brian on. If you guys are interested in learning presuppositional apologetics, I teach an online course called Presup U. You can sign up for that course on revealedapologetics.com. And I've been getting a lot of messages from people about the dates. So like when you click on to sign up for the course, it looks like the course is taking place within a certain time span, like a date from this date to that date. Completely ignore that. If you want to sign up, and it is a work at your own pace. And so you could sign up right now, and I'll send you all of the lectures, the PowerPoint slides, all the outlines and notes, and you can do that. And we've already done that with a group a couple of months ago, and they really enjoyed it, especially when we had kind of that face-to-face interaction when I did that sort of class. Right now, if you sign up, you just get the class, but I'm going to be letting folks know when the premium package will be available, and that includes kind of a face-to-face with me and the other students, in which we can kind of go a little deeper into the content. So definitely, if you're interested in that, revealedapologetics.com. All right, all that out of the way. All right, good. That's kind of filler because I want to wait till people coming in and listening. So now we have some listeners. So with that said, let me introduce Brian Knapp. How's it going, Brian?
It's going good, Eli.
Very good. I just want to give you a heads up. I say this to everyone. I'm looking at you, but it doesn't look like I'm looking at you. Okay. So I have my camera in front of me here, and then I have my laptop. So when I'm looking at my laptop, I'm looking right at you. So I don't want you to think I'm playing Candy Crush while you're going, when you're going into your responses to my questions. All right. So as we start, why don't you tell people a little bit about you that goes beyond what I've already shared?
Sure. Well, I'm a software engineer by trade, and a contractor, and I've been doing that ever since I got out of high school, basically. But it wasn't until maybe about 20 or so years ago, and I'm already dating myself, but 20 or so years ago that I got into Presup, and it was based on being involved on the internet. Like, that's a great fertile ground for interacting with people of all different beliefs. And I found my way into, I think it was called the MSNBC Religion and Ethics Board. And I was all excited, and, but I just walked in completely unprepared, and got hit with a couple of different arguments that really got me trying to think more critically. I really didn't have any background in critical thinking or philosophy either. And so I went to a local Lifeway bookstore and met a fellow who's a dear friend of mine now, and has been for many years, and he was just learning about presuppositional apologetics. And so we would get together at his house or my house, and sometimes with the third fella, and listen to Bahnsen tapes at that point, literal cassette tapes, yes, that we had gotten from Covenant Media, and then we would sit around and discuss them. And so the more I learned about Presup, the more I realized my theological commitments were not what they should be as well. A lot of people come to Presup as a result of a reformed view of Scripture, whereas for me it was just the opposite. I got into Presup and began to realize the power of it. And as I looked and listened to Dr. Bahnsen going to Scripture and sharing, his foundation and Van Til's foundation, it became apparent to me that I needed to adjust my theological commitments as well. So, so at that point, I found my way into Dr. White's, James White's chat channel, and met up with a whole bunch of other people, Chris Bolt and other people who have contributed to Choosing Hats. And from that point on, it's mostly been just interacting with different groups online, teaching classes at my church, those types of things. So I don't have a full-time ministry by any means doing Presup, but I do take the opportunities as God gives them to me to share this particular method. So.
Very good. I'm being told that you perhaps you need to turn your volume up just a little bit. I mean, it's not like people can't hear you, but it might be a little. So
is this any better?
Oh, why you got to yell, man? That's a little too much. I'm just kidding. You're good. That sounds much better. Okay. What interests me about what you said there is that you don't have any formal training in apologetics, which I think is for some people that might be a minus, and for other people that's actually a plus. And I do think there is a sense in which it's a minus and a plus. It is a minus in the sense that perhaps without formal training, we may lack the ability to be as precise as we need to be with our language and are argument form, but that's not necessarily true. I mean, you could be, you don't need formal training to be good at that, but typically that's the case. If you're not formally trained, those things, we can run into those sorts of things. However, the fact that you're not formally trained, but you're able to use this apologetic quite effectively, I think speaks a lot to really what 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 15 is getting at, where all of us, every Christian, is called to give a reason for the hope that's in them. And so have you found that in your interactions with people that you kind of are able to stand back and see the effectiveness of this method, even when you feel perhaps intellectually, and I'm not saying you're not a smart guy, but you know what I mean? When we don't have that formal training, there can be kind of a timidity that goes into like approaching these debates and these arguments. Have you found the strength of the presuppositional approach and encouragement because you've been able to use it effectively even without that training? I guess that's what I'm trying to ask.
Yeah. Great question. And the answer is yes, definitely. I've heard Dr. Bonson say it before that at the end of the day, everybody has to answer the same questions, right?
Sure.
Everybody has a philosophy. They have to be able to account for the criticisms or the value judgments that they make. And sometimes you're interacting with somebody who is speaking a different language entirely. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, I don't know the words. I don't understand the words you're using. Can you dumb them down for me?
Sure.
The method itself and this approach to apologetics is so very powerful for that reason, that it really addresses the core underlying implicit or explicit beliefs that somebody holds to, regardless of what their field of study is, what level of education they have, that type of thing. So yeah, I've definitely come up against individuals with a lot more training. And again, that was one of the ways that I was motivated to be able to go and defend my faith, is because I was speaking to atheists, PhDs in philosophy on a daily basis, just getting hammered to death. Yeah. So,
well, it's a good point. You said that we all have to answer the same questions. If you teach people, a believer, they're taught what questions to ask, they can be effective. Right. And knowing your worldview, knowing what all worldviews hold in common and the weaknesses of certain worldviews. I think it's important to, what I like about the presuppositional approach is that it's a worldview approach. And in a sense, that makes our job a lot easier. And I don't want to substitute that for like hard study, because we do want to know the ins and outs of someone's perspective. But it's actually quite encouraging to know that the presuppositional approach is effective, even if you don't know every detail of another person's worldview. When you're doing apologetics, and you're talking to an atheist or whoever you're talking to, since you don't know every single detail of their perspective, what are some things you look for as a presuppositionalist? What is your presuppositional thinking? Mm-hmm. What are you looking for in what the unbeliever says to kind of give you a foundation to then, as we say in popular parlance, presup them?
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things for me, at least, that go on. One is I sit there and listen to them, and I will try.
Presuppositionalists listen to people.
We do. It's not a well-known fact, but yes. And also asking questions. Right, the Socratic method is a great way to get people to maybe stop and think about what, things they haven't thought about before. Sure. But what I'm generally doing is I want to draw out of them what the issues they have with Christianity, right? What are your criticisms, or what are you skeptical of? What are you unsure of? Or what do you claim that you're unsure of and that you don't know, right? So for me, it's just letting them share things with me. And honestly, the more you do it, the more you realize that generally you're going to get the same kind of criticisms, right? Sure. You're going to get the problem of evil packaged in a lot of different ways. You're going to get, science versus God. So talking about, evolution, those types of things. And then you will quite often get much more specific criticisms, about trying to, figure out, how many days was Jesus in the ground, or how do you put together these two different passages in the Gospels that don't seem to fit. The other thing I'm doing is I'm looking for areas where they either explicitly bring up or it's kind of implied
Okay.
something about Christianity that I don't believe.
Sure.
Because in my experience, one of the biggest challenges with discussion or debating anybody else is making sure that you know what they believe and that they have a proper representation of what you believe.
Right.
And like you said, Presup works at the worldview level, which can make it really challenging for other people who don't have familiarity with it and are debating with you.
Sure.
They don't understand that you want to talk about everything, right? You can't do it all at once, but it's all relevant. So most criticisms that I've heard of Christianity will pick a couple things here and there,
Sure.
and then they will take their own presuppositions, their own worldview, and usher those bits and pieces from Christianity along and come to, no surprise, a conclusion that doesn't match what is somewhere else in Scripture, for instance.
Sure, absolutely. Now, what I think is important to keep in mind, it made me think about it because you said that you were looking for things that the unbeliever was going to say that you don't believe as a Christian, and I think that kind of just made it flash in my mind the importance of knowing systematic theology. Is actually knowing doctrine so that you could identify things that are alien to Christianity, but your interlocutor thinks that it's an essential feature. And in many cases, his misconception is a stumbling block to him. Right. So when people ask me, what's the best book to learn presuppositional apologetics? Now, don't get me wrong. I'll point you to Bonson. I'll point you to Van Til. But sometimes the best books, in my opinion, maybe you could speak to this, the best books on apologetics are not apologetics books. They're books on basic Christian doctrine, Bible commentaries, the Bible itself, right? Yep. Do you agree with that?
Oh, definitely. I mean, to put it sort of I don't know, maybe crass, if you have a product you want to sell, you got to have product knowledge, right? And sure. Obviously we're not selling it in the same sense, but little known fact, I did sell cars. I actually sold used cars as well as new ones.
Like, you're nothing but a cheap.
I was a used car salesman.
No,
I did this for 8 months, and the biggest challenge for me was learning. Because at that point I wasn't into cars at all, sure. And I really didn't have much understanding of the different types of vehicles. And so when they would come in to bring in a trade, I really wouldn't know, I recognized what they were driving, but I didn't know enough about it to be able to help, put a value on it.
Sure.
So by analogy, same thing with Christianity or anything else you are trying to defend, right? That's the thing about an apologetic. We think of it in terms of defending Christianity, but the word just means, a reasoned defense of sure. Whatever it is you happen to be defending, and you have to know what it is you're defending from a practical perspective. I mean, we're called as Christians to know God's word for other reasons as well, but definitely as an apologist, you've got to know Scripture. It's a never-ending thing.
Right, that's right. Now, I wanted to get back to something you said. You said something to the effect that you want to listen to what the unbeliever says. Now, presuppositionalists have a bad reputation online in other various contexts. Presuppositionalists are perceived to be the sorts of people that listen only for the purpose of responding. Mm-hmm. When you say you're listening, why don't you unpack that for us? What do you mean listening? Are you just listening so that you could hop on something? Are you genuinely listening to what the person has to say? See, what is the heart behind that? So that people, here's what I hear. Maybe you've heard this. Presuppositionalism is a disingenuous apologetic method. You ever hear that?
Yes.
How would you respond to that?
Well, I think there are probably some examples of individuals who present one of two things. Either they don't, it's a two-step approach, which we can talk about, and they only do one step, and that step is primarily trying to tear down the other person, and not necessarily in a bad way, like trying to beat them into the ground, but just trying to pick apart their particular belief system, and saying by what standard. I've seen way too many memes and way too many GIFs, and just. It's an important thing to say at the right time. It shouldn't be the goal of your apologetic encounter to be able to say, by what standard, haha, and that's it, right? No, we're trying to help them understand. We're trying, we're not supposed to quarrel with them. We're supposed to have, a reasonable discussion with them. And as Christians, we're supposed to be loving. But what I'm looking for is things that they are saying that lead me to believe they don't understand what I believe, what I actually believe, right? And that can come out a couple different ways. Either it's just buried down in there, like they're making all these surface level claims,
Sure.
But in order for those claims to be meaningful or for them to have warrant to hold the beliefs, there have to be other things underneath them, or behind them, or whatever terminology you want to use. And so a lot of it is listening for them to say something that allows me to start to dig deeper. And it may just be, well, by what standard? Like there's a friend of mine who I talk with. He's not a Christian by any means, but he's a great guy, and we have great discussions about scripture, and he knows what presuppositionalism is because I laid it out for him. And so, sure, I'll joke with him when he makes some sort of a value judgment and say, by what standard, right? But generally speaking, that's not what I'm doing. I might say something like, well, I agree with you that particular thing is wrong, but can you tell me why you think it's wrong?
That's just a wordy way of saying
by what standard? And I put it that way because it's going to depend on the person you're interacting with, right? Sure. I mean, sure. Some people have, some apologists have the ability to read the person they're talking to, sure. Body language, and listen to what they're saying. For others, that's a skill they are working to develop right now. Yeah. But in either case, the key is to listen to what they're saying, look at them, and try and understand, what is the pain point, as it were.
Sure. I like the way what you just said there, and I think that's a lot of people don't talk about this enough in apologetic books and things like that. But knowing body language and tethering your responses, your questions, your statements to the body language of the individual, I think is a very important apologetic strategy, not just a communication strategy. Apologists are communicators. We're communicating the truth. And it's not always within the context of a formal debate or online atheism or whatever, whatever the case may be. We're talking to regular people, right? And I'm going to speak to someone who's struggling with, some kind of traumatic experience. I'm going to speak with them in a different way than I'm going to speak with, the annoying teenage kid who thinks evolution is the fact and the Bible is stupid. Right. We need to learn to read people so that we respond appropriately. I think that's a very important aspect of apologetics. Instead of just living here, we need to be able to kind of identify, what's this person all about? Where are they coming from? And I think you can tell a lot through someone's body language. Yeah, I'm not trying. Well, when I'm doing it right, I'm not trying to win an argument. I'm not looking for an opportunity to slap them down and take away their ability to argue. And although that's part of what we try to do presuppositionally, is take away any, it's like the analogy Bonson used, where if you're in a room with a guy and he's got a gun with bullets in it, you can learn to dodge bullets, or you can learn to take the gun away. And I think that's what Presup is about, is taking away ultimately their ability to make meaningful arguments. Yeah. But there's a lot of groundwork to be laid, and understanding that person and how much time you're going to have with them, and certainly not making them upset to the point where you can't continue the conversation another day, right? I mean, it is sharing the gospel ultimately, right? It's doing it it's the other side of the coin. It's doing it from a defense perspective or addressing criticism, but the goal is the same. It's to bring glory to God, and to do whatever we can by sharing God's word to see them get saved. That's the goal. I like what you used there. Dr. Bonson was really good at, creating those mental pictures. You can learn to dodge bullets, or you can learn to take the gun out of the guy's hands. I like where he spoke about the difference between proof and persuasion. And he said that when you shoot a bear and the bear keeps coming at you, that doesn't mean your gun doesn't work. Some bears take more than one shot. So just because a person is not persuaded by your argument doesn't mean you did not give a valid and good argument. So those are fun ways that help us remember some key aspects of the apologetic interaction. So I appreciated that. Real quick, for people in the comments, if you have any questions, please leave them there. I know Patrick Sue has left a bunch of questions. Dylan McPhee has left a bunch of questions, and I really appreciate that you prefaced your question with the word question. That's definitely super helpful. And we already have some really good questions in the chat here. So keep asking them away. You can just totally bombard the comments with a bunch of questions, and we'll get to as many as possible. Yeah, so Chris Bolt's in the chat. He says, why do you say that Chris Bolt? Let me see. Let's get him up here. Why do you say that Chris Bolt is the greatest living Christian apologist? Oh my goodness. So
that's an example of a particular fallacy, which is why he asked it that way. The complex question or the loaded question.
Oh man.
We can break it down, but
he's not the great. I didn't say he's the greatest. I say he's the most humble.
You're not helping him.
Let's not encourage him. All right, so keep those questions coming. We'll get to them eventually, but definitely continue to preface with the word question. That's super helpful. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some standard let's not jump into objections just yet that we often hear.
Can I just add one thing to what I was saying before?
Sure, absolutely.
Learning systematic theology, really important. Learning some critical thinking skills, really important. Also very important is rhetoric. And I hate to say it, but not necessarily to use it, but to be able to recognize it. When somebody says, well, obviously everybody knows this, right? Or somebody draws a conclusion that doesn't follow from the premises or whatever. It's good to be able to separate what tends to be the emotional language, which is the more rhetorical stuff, or the use of rhetoric, versus the actual removed from passion, removed from emotion argument. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be passionate or emotional. That's very important, especially dealing with certain topics. But it's always critical to be able to separate and sort of just toss away and not be rattled by certain statements that that the person that you're talking with might throw at you. And my skin is much thicker now, way thicker now than it was 20 some years ago.
I think that's a very important point. I'm a teacher, and so for many years I taught apologetics to middle school and high school students, and I usually start the class with coming from an atheistic perspective and asking them tough questions, and then I later explain to them, and this is a good way to do with like small groups and people who are just getting started in apologetics. I like to help people feel or help them know what it feels like to be uncomfortable in hearing objections.
Yep.
Within I don't like to use this terminology because it's loaded, but within a safe space. we don't want to go there. But when we're training people who are just getting into apologetics, creating a safe space and helping them know what it feels like to be uncomfortable, so that when they actually go out into the world, they're not frazzled by rhetoric. You're able to get past a lot of the word salad that people are throwing out there that sound convincing, but really they're not really giving you an argument or anything like that. I think that's a huge part in doing apologetics well, is being able to not just get hot under the collar every time someone says something that is filled with emotion and rhetoric. I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind. All right. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about apologetic methodology. So we have presuppositional apologetics, and then we have the evidential and classical apologetics. For people who perhaps don't know the difference, do you think you can summarize just real briefly? You don't have to go into, into great detail, but what is the difference between a presuppositional approach, classical approach, and the evidential approach?
So presup is the biblical approach, and the others aren't.
Here. That's right.
Yeah, I'm gonna upset some people with that, but hey, we're having fun, right?
It's all good.
I mean, for me, going back to my experience, I had a really hard time adapting to thinking presuppositionally. So the reason I say that is because I think the evidential or other approaches that are akin to it are what seem to be, approaches that make the most sense at first, because we are used to, when somebody's asking us, is there a box of crackers in the pantry? There's a particular approach that we take to answer that question.
Right.
But from the perspective of Christianity, it is, again, it's an entire worldview, and you can't answer that question the same way. So the Presup approach is one that's going to look more at, what makes something a fact, or what makes something an evidence that can be used to draw a conclusion, sure, versus just presenting the fact as if we don't need to worry about those things. I think there's a very strong philosophical case for why we should argue presuppositionally and think that way. And I think there's a strong biblical case for it as well.
So what you're saying is that facts don't speak for themselves.
Yeah, there are no brute facts.
That's right. What did Van Til say? Very helpful. What did Van Til say about brute facts? Brute facts are...
I give up, Eli. What did he say?
Oh, come on. I love it. It helped me a lot when I remember. Brute facts are mute facts.
I have not heard that.
You've never heard that? Van Til, man.
It's catchy. I like that.
Well, Van Til was good at those catches. So brute facts are mute facts. Facts don't speak, right? You need a model of interpretation. You need a worldview context. When I teach it to my students, I always speak in terms of like words in a sentence. So the only way you know what a word means is its context. What are the other words around that word? You need a context to make sense out of the particular thing. So their facts don't just speak to us, they require an interpretive model. So addressing those foundational issues really gets us to the issue of presuppositions, which you said, what are the foundations there? But go ahead, why don't you continue with the different methodologies there? So,
a more specific example would be, an evidential model is going to be somebody who says, we have a good reason to believe that Christ rose from the dead. Here are the evidences, both from the perspective of how the story or the narrative is told in Scripture, plus extra biblical evidence, those types of things. A presuppositionalist is not going to concentrate so much. It's not that they shouldn't or aren't going to bring the same evidence, up, but it's going to be presented always from the perspective that the foundations for thinking, the philosophical foundations that make those facts meaningful at all, at the end of the day, is the Christian worldview. And so to not keep that in mind and not leverage that, to me, doesn't really make sense, because you're giving the non-Christian an excuse, essentially, and God tells us they are without excuse. Everybody knows that God exists, and I know that's a point of a topic for another discussion, perhaps, but we have to understand as Christians that the world is a certain way because God made it that way. So we certainly don't want to go about presenting arguments that don't keep that in mind, that don't depend or rely on that, because our ability to even discuss apologetics depends on the world, the universe, and us being the way that we are, being created in such a way that we can even have a meaningful discussion. So.
Right. Now, what would you say is the key? Just so someone says, okay, so I'm tracking with you, but like, what's the main difference? So you got presuppositionalism and say classicalism, for example. Okay. What is the nugget that differentiates them?
I think one really important difference is direct versus indirect.
Okay.
In other words, I think an evidential approach is going to be more direct, discursive, I think is the right word. Okay. Saying, here are the facts, and the result of it is this conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead. Whereas from a presuppositional standpoint, we're going to look at things backwards, perhaps. That's not a good choice.
Mm.
From the, in an indirect manner.
Sure.
When Bahnsen talks about specifically how do you run a transcendental argument, the transcendental argument for God, he talks about starting with a given. In other words, find something that the person you're talking with doesn't doubt. You don't want to give them the ability to come around later in the conversation and say, well, I guess I don't really believe that either. Find something that they're just really confident of, and then go to work explaining how that thing that's a given can only be a given for them, or could only be a given if creation and nature were the way it is according to the Christian worldview. So it's not lining up a bunch of evidences and then drawing a conclusion. It's more like reaching out and getting them to give you something to work with. And that's one of the things I think that will frustrate a lot of people who are debating a presuppositionalist is
Sure.
a presupper who's taking that approach is going to be asking for something. And if the other person doesn't want to give you something, well, then you really don't have anywhere to go anyway, right? If they want to play the full-on skeptical game, okay, you can't do that and have a rational discussion.
Sure. Okay. All right. Very good. Let's talk a little bit about some objections. So we cover this, and I like to cover it all the time because, people bring it up as though we never thought about it. So I usually make a big deal out of it because it's asked all the time. We've answered it in past episodes, but you know what? We're going to answer it here again. Okay. So one of the most common objections to presuppositionalism is that it's circular. Like you can't assume the thing you're trying to prove. Like that's begging the question, right? That's the problem with you presuppositionalists, is that you just make assertions. You can assume the conclusion from the beginning, and that's just, it's just your assertion. Any religion can do that. You guys aren't even giving an argument, why doesn't that, when someone says you're begging the question or you're engaging in circular reasoning, why doesn't that make you as a presuppositionalist say, oh my goodness, I never considered that before? Right.
Well, I mean, one of the things, at least for me, and I think for most people who believe that Presup is the right approach, have had to deal with that, and probably
Sure.
fairly early into their education, right?
Sure.
So it doesn't concern me because I'm arguing at the worldview level. I'm arguing at the a person's philosophy level, and that you can't get away from. You can't step outside of any commitments and argue. There's no neutrality, right? You can't step away from any of these preconditions to make your argument. At a minimum, you've got things like general reliability of your senses and your memory, and belief that there are other people that exist, and communication and logic, right? So there's all those things that are there holding up your ability to argue in the first place.
Sure.
Now, what is holding your particular argument up? What is making what is giving you warrant for believing those things that you do about your memory and your rational thinking process, those types of things? Well, there's more basic beliefs below that. And so if those most basic beliefs are what you're going to defend, it's not possible to defend those without holding to them and relying upon them. So for me, when somebody claims that it's circular reasoning, I try to get them to see two things. Number one, they're in the same boat, which in and of itself is not sufficient, right? Sure. But it's good for them to understand that they have the same issue. And you can do that by asking them, like if I were to say to you, why do you think your memory is reliable? Or why do you think your senses are reliable? Or why do you believe that the laws of logic have any applicability to the world around you? All those types of things. I try to get them to see that if they were asked to defend that most basic set of beliefs, they would be in the same situation.
Sure.
Sure. And at that point, it's the other part of it is to say it's not circular because it's not this the vicious circle that people are most familiar with.
Sure.
The other thing to keep in mind is that, and I mentioned it earlier with the crackers in the pantry, which comes from Bonson's debate, right? What we're defending is an entire worldview. So you can't assume that you're going to be able to answer a particular criticism necessarily just by giving one particular fact.
Sure.
When that criticism relies upon, your answer to that criticism relies upon Christianity actually being true. So now, it usually comes back to the Bible. You say you believe something and somebody criticizes it and you talk and then they say, well, why do you believe that? And you say, well, because the Bible says so. Well, why do you believe the Bible is true? Well, because God wrote it. Well, why do you believe God wrote it? Right. So at some point you're going to get back to your most basic belief, and there's no way for you to defend that. If it is actually a basic belief for you, there's no way to defend that without bringing it in, without assuming it.
What about people who, there are people out there that believe that foundationalists,
right?
They aren't. I'm not a foundationalist in that classical sense, but what are they arguing that they're saying something to the effect that we could have foundations? Would they hold to a foundation in a non-circular fashion? They would say,
yes.
Okay. So why is that not the case? So let's address the foundation that says, wait a minute. You're saying that at the foundation, we all have to hold to these foundations self-attestingly and circularly. But I'm a foundationalist, bro. I don't have to do that. And here's why. What are they saying, and why can't they avoid the circle? It's
interesting because I was scheduled to have a debate with a classical foundationalist. At least I believe he is. Sorry, David, if you're not. But that was what I got in my preparation, or as far as I got in my preparation.
I was supposed to debate David as well.
Yeah.
And that felt. I'm just so busy, but I'm sure you understand. But go ahead.
Yeah. I look forward to actually at least having a discussion with him in the future. Sure. I think that's going to happen. But actually, he's got a really cool video on YouTube where he goes through and he lays out the different ways of dealing with, and I forget his terminology, but it's like the infinite chain of justification or whatever it is, where a belief is justified by something more basic, which is justified by something more basic, so on and so forth. How do you stop? Some people will say, well, there is an infinite chain of justification and we don't have to worry about that. Or, some people will make it more based on the consensus of a group that you're in. And if everybody holds the same basic beliefs, well, then you can go ahead and talk about knowing things. I believe a classical foundationalist is going to say there are basic beliefs that do not need to be justified in the same way that beliefs that depend on them do. Now, okay. I'm not going to say more than that because I don't understand it sufficiently to be able to. Sure.
Something doesn't sound kosher if you've represented it correctly. It just is just a bunch that seems wrong with that. But we don't want to digress and critique it without proper.
To give David credit, I think he did a really good job explaining why those particular beliefs in question don't need to be justified in the same way. So it's not like they are axioms and you're just saying, well, here's where we're going to start because it works, or it gives us the ability to predict the future or whatever. They have an actual robustly thought about and defended perspective and that was one of the reasons I was excited to have a discussion when the opportunity came up, and still hope to do so. But obviously I'm going to have to learn more about classical foundationalism.
Right. Well, good thing there's a lot of YouTube videos out there. And
that's right.
Definitely. But all right. So I'm gonna move into some of the questions. There's a lot of questions, and I want to make sure I respect your time, but also get to all these questions since the title of this is Everything Presup. So there's a bunch of presuppositional sort of questions, and I will be here as well. So if you are having difficulty with one, we could tag team, right?
Yep.
Tag team Presup. All right. So let's see here.
If I take a drink of water, that's your key. That your cue.
Yes. Let's see. Questions. All right. So this is a common one. So Dylan McPhee asks, Our proof as presuppers is the impossibility of the contrary, correct? Have you examined every possible worldview? So basically, the question is, how can we say that our position as Christians is true by the impossibility of the contrary if we have not inductively examined all possible worldview perspectives?
Okay. One thing I would say is that's not Presup so much as it is the transcendental argument. So tag, which, is a presuppositional based argument, at least from a Van Tillian perspective and a Bahnsen perspective, is an argument that you're making from the impossibility of the contrary. The answer is no, from the perspective of it's not as if we look at all the non-Christian worldviews and say, well, we've knocked this one down, we've knocked that one down, we've knocked this one down. Obviously, that doesn't work because we don't know what they all are. There might be a new one that comes along later. But one of the more basic parts or initial things that needs to get laid out if you are going to use tag is that there are at base only two worldviews, and the non-Christian one is false, and one of them, at least one of them, has to be true, or you couldn't be sitting here having a reasonable conversation. And so, if the one that's contrary, or more accurately, the contradictory of Christianity is false, and one of those two must be true, well, then necessarily it must be Christianity that's true. Now, there's a lot behind that, and there's a lot of disagreement over that, right? So, and definitely beyond the scope of our discussion, but just to summarize, that particular IOC, impossibility of the contrary, is tied more specifically to tag. It's not something that is part of Presup in general.
Okay, I got you. What might tickle someone's curiosity is the fact that you said there are only two worldviews. And yes, we know there are multiple worldviews, but in essence, there is the Christian worldview and the non-Christian worldview. And everything that's not Christianity is lumped into the category of not Christianity, right? The non-Christian worldview. And so we would argue, at least I would, that all of them have the same deficiency. So that if you refute the deficiency in one of them, you've refuted the deficiency in all of them. Now, if you disagree that some other non-Christian worldview has the same deficiency as other ones, you could discuss that, but I could assure you, I'm quite confident that they all share the same deficiency. And I think it's appropriate to break them up into two categories: Christian worldview, non-Christian worldview. Also, Dr. Bahnsen gave a good explanation. We're arguing that the Christian worldview provides the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience, knowledge, and all those sorts of things. If Christianity is a necessary precondition for intelligibility, it does provide the necessary preconditions for intelligible experience, then therefore it must be the only worldview that provides it. You can't have multiple worldviews that provide equally the necessary preconditions for intelligibility. There's some issues there that's problematic as to why that can't be the case. So if the Christian worldview is one, then it must be the only one, since the claim that it's the only one is actually part of the package deal that is Christianity. So if that is an appropriate way to address this question, then you can demonstrate the truth of the Christian worldview without having to inductively examine every single worldview perspective. All right. So I hope that makes sense a little bit for the person who asked the question. Brian, you could expand on that or disagree with me or whichever.
No, I do. I think you brought in an additional premise that needed to be brought in, and that is there has to be one, and there can only be one, right? And that's that second one that you brought in. So there are a lot of things that you and the person you're talking to at this more philosophical level, which I rarely do when I'm actually having an apologetic discussion with somebody. It's all of those things need to be laid out. I think a lot of times presuppers will run in too quickly and without laying the groundwork. So that's one of the important things as far as listening is evaluating what the nature of the conversation is going to be in 10 or 15 minutes. Like, do you think that this person's going to go there, that they want to go there? Right. And if I sense them going there, a lot of times I'll say, hey, before I, answer your question, how I know the Bible's true or whatever it may be, there's some other things that I have to lay out first. And I would love to do that, and we can argue over them, but I'm not just going to come out and say, Christianity is true from the impossibility of the contrary and expect anyone to buy into that. If they haven't bought into all of the other earlier hidden premises that haven't, been brought up yet. They need to be brought up, they need to be agreed upon, or else you can't build upon those.
Right. And I think that's important you pointed that out, because everything we're saying here, there's more that can be said and there's more that should be said. So, take what I've said and what Brian has said with a grain of salt and look into the details as to how one might unpack that. But I do think in this format, it's important to mention that those are some of the ways you could approach the question, because that gives you something to think about. How is it the case that if Christianity is a worldview that provides the necessary preconditions, that it has to be the only one? Why is that the case? Those are good things to think about and mull over in your mind. Okay. But there's definitely more to unpack. So we don't just get away with that by simply stating it that way. I hope that makes sense, Dylan. All right. Dylan has another one here. Our proof as presuppers. Oh, nope. That's a double question. Never mind.
He really wants an answer.
Yeah, he really wants an answer. There we go. Okay. Someone wants you to respond to a quote. Okay. So here is Patrick Sue. Thank you for your question / statement / quotation. I have never seen the slightest scientific proof of the religious ideas of heaven and hell, of future life for individuals, or of a personal God. Thomas Edison. How would you respond to Thomas Edison, the inventor of the light bulb?
Right. Well, first of all, it's not necessarily important to do this because it's a good question. Sure. But I would determine if Edison actually said that. I'm not saying he didn't. I'm just saying as part of what I would do in responding to that, if I had the ability to do it, the first thing I would do is I just want to know if it was him that said it, right? Because there's just so much out there right now. But let's assume it doesn't matter who said it. It's a question, right? A person is saying they've never seen the slightest scientific proof of things like heaven and hell. Okay, well, I really want to say by what standard, but I won't say that. Essentially, what you need to talk about is what do you consider to be scientific proof? Okay. Yeah. And given the nature of heaven and hell, future life, and God, the way they are described, would you expect to see scientific evidence or scientific proof for those things? It's the cracker in the pantry thing all over again. You have to, and it's not just a cheat to get out of having to use science to prove God.
Right.
Anything that you want to, any truth claim you want to prove to be true, or anything you want to demonstrate the existence of, you have to take into account what is being said about it. How is it described? It doesn't make sense to say on the one hand that God is a spirit, and at the same time, God the Father, and at the same time say, so why can't I see him? Well, you can't see things that aren't extended in space, that don't have an existence. That's just the way that we've been made. That doesn't mean that he doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean you can't prove it. It's just you're not going to prove it using the tools that you use to prove crackers in the pantry.
So in essence, the way in which you prove something depends upon the nature of that which you're seeking to prove. So I would prove that there are crackers in the pantry differently than if I were to prove to you that the air pressure in a room was some percentage. I mean, right. So look at the question here. So it says, I've never seen, which within the scientifically minded person, that typically involves some sort of empirical demonstration, which again, as you pointed out, it needs to be put in context with the idea of heaven and hell, or God, or spiritual things. I mean, if we're going to prove God at all, if we're able to prove him, we're not going to prove him in a way that's inconsistent with the sort of being that he is, which is basically all proof is not look and see. Unless you think that look and see empirical methods are the only way to prove things. I mean, that's why I would say that what do you mean by proof and what do you consider evidence, I think are valid questions. And as you said, they're not, get out of jail free cards. Literally, when I ask those questions, what I find is that the standard of what is counted as evidence is completely wrong-headed. And it's important you bring that out, because if you're going to prove something, I need to know what you mean by proof. If I'm going to give you evidence for something, I need to know what you mean by evidence. These aren't just kind of self-evident terms. Well, everyone knows. Well, no, they don't. What you consider evidence and proof is going to be worldview dependent. And so we do need to get to those deeper issues. All right. Patrick Sue gives us another quote. I think that's a good way to do this. I think I like quotes because we live in kind of a soundbite generation here. And so Christians might encounter this. Here's another quote by Christopher Hitchens. We're assuming it's Christopher Hitchens. Since it is obviously inconceivable that all religions can be right, the most reasonable conclusion is that they are all wrong. Okay. Have fun with that one, Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure I've read that before. I would want to ask him why. Why, he was a very bright guy, right? I don't believe he said that without having some reason for saying it. And that's what I would want to know. Just reading it at a cursory level, no, that conclusion doesn't follow at all. That, I would agree that they can't all be right because they contradict each other. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means I'm using logic, and I'm using all these other things. And so one of the things that really annoys people is when you ask them where they're standing when they make their argument. But that's one question I would have asked Christopher is, and it's kind of tied to by what standard. It's like, you're coming to me as a professing atheist saying that your worldview is X, Y, Z.
Sure.
If that were the case, that's where you're standing. That's the ground you're standing on philosophically when you're making your argument. So I would want to press with him, like anybody else, the foundations that he's arguing from. But just in general, that argument is not robust enough or doesn't have enough information in it to draw the conclusion that he's drawing.
Sure.
There has to be more there. Just like earlier when we said proving God exists from the impossibility of the contrary, we know what that means. We know all of the hidden assumptions or premises that we haven't brought up yet. But the person who hears us just say that soundbite doesn't know what those things are.
Right.
So I don't find that it's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. It's not the most reasonable conclusion.
Right. And when you're speaking of reason, we're assuming logical categories. So if we're going to be reasonable, then we're also going to be logical. And if we're going to be logical, then his conclusion doesn't logically follow.
Right. Plus the fact that, he's putting religions against non-religions when, the term religion is a word that describes people who hold to fervent beliefs. There's quite often, revelation involved, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, from a Presup perspective, there's a worldview that I'm defending here. And so you could recast this and say, since it's obviously inconceivable that all worldviews are true, the most reasonable is that they're all wrong. No, that doesn't follow at all. There's good reason to believe there's at least one that's correct.
That's right. All right. Here's another question. Patrick strikes again. He's got a bunch of them, but it's all good. Can you describe real life encounters with unbelievers where you use the presuppositional method? How did it go?
Let me start at the end of that question. How did it go? Because I think there's an implication there or a question to be answered of what is a successful apologetic encounter.
Good point.
And I think I don't know. I'm not going to put words in Patrick's mouth, but to answer your question, yeah, I've had these kind of discussions with people who are atheists, with people who hold to different religions, and in general, the ones that are the most successful, I would say, are the ones where I have the time to talk with them and really get them to question and understand why I'm arguing the way I'm arguing, why I'm not just bringing evidence up. For instance, the one friend I mentioned earlier, I think he has a pretty good understanding of what Presup is and why I argue the way I do now. And so I think it's successful to some degree in that he understands, I think even biblically, why I argue that way. And so I think that anytime that we talk about the truth of Scripture and we properly represent God and who he is, then that's success. Because I think ultimately that's what we're after, is to glorify God. Yes, of course, we want people to come to a saving knowledge of Christ. But the more or most important thing is God being glorified.
I guess I'll share my story as well, because I hear a lot of people say, well, presuppositional apologetics is just impractical. It never works. Right. I've had a lot of encounters with people. And I agree with Brian that time is definitely an important issue to consider. My conversations with people have definitely been more effective when I've had the time to unpack things and to have conversations, within the context of a relationship. There was a guy that I worked with for some years. I used to do childcare. So we would basically watch parents would drop off their kids 2.5 hours before school started. So we'd be with them, help with them with homework, play games with them, and then send them off to class. And then from 3 to 6, we'd watch them until their parents picked them up from work. So we used to have counselors, right? Not counselors where we sit down with the kids and be like, tell me your life, like camp counselors,
camp counselors, right?
Right. And so I had this friend, his name was Will. And after the kids went off to school, we would grab egg sandwiches, breakfast sandwiches, and we'd sit in my car, and he was an atheist. And he would ask a bunch of different questions. And this was when I was listening to a lot of Bonson. So I was using a lot of the presuppositional sort of stuff. And we had great conversations. And I made various points that were an application of the presuppositional approach, where my friend was unable to give a reasoned response. And we had conversations throughout the course of the years. He invited me to his house. He had this documentary that he found online that he thought disproved Christianity, and he invited all his atheist friends there and invited me over, and we watched this movie, and I was able to respond all from a presuppositional approach. Right. Now, get out of the way. I no longer work there. He doesn't work there. I don't see him for like 5 years. Okay. Now, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. She still is. So she's undergoing some chemo and things like that. Nothing too severe. So it's not, no one has to private message being like, I'm so sorry. I mean, she's doing okay. There's little issues here and there. But she was diagnosed with cancer, and she was in the hospital. And so I went to go visit her in the hospital. And as I parked my car and got out of my car, someone grabbed me from behind, a bear hug. I literally thought I was going to get mugged. I was like, oh, snap, it's on, This person, no, I am black belt in karate movies, so they're endangering themselves by attacking me. At any rate, the person grabbed me from behind, and instead of saying hi or hey, it's me, the person just grabbed me and said, Eli. And I was like, I recognize his voice. I'm like, that's Will. I'm like, Will? And he's like, he didn't say hi. He didn't say, how's it going? He didn't say why I'm here. He says, the first thing, I haven't spoken to him in 5 years. He says, thank you. And I was like, what are you talking about, dude? He's like, I just want to thank you. Those conversations we had all those years ago, they impacted me so much, and I never forgot them. And he told me, he's like, I'm going to seminary. I'm going to be a youth pastor.
Oh, wow.
And I lived on Long Island, New York. Now I live in North Carolina. Long Island's a little fishy looking island right off next to New York, the state of New York there. And there's a border island called Fire Island. And he was invited to give his first sermon at a church on Fire Island. And he paid for my family to take a ferry and go to Fire Island and listen to his first sermon. And he shared how our conversations impacted him and played a very important role in his conversion. So all that to say, when people say presuppositional apologetics is not practical, it doesn't work, listen, whether you're using classical, evidential, presuppositional, there are going to be moments where we feel like, quote, it's not working. But in this case, this was an empirical evidence that it did affect him in such a way that God used it for his glory and brought this person to faith. So just to kind of a tangible example as to the effectiveness of this approach, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I think Bonson actually said that that's how he came to Christ, was through a presuppositional presentation.
Oh, yeah?
Yep.
Okay. Wow. I didn't know that. All right. Let's continue. How are you doing? Are you okay to take some more questions?
Yeah. I've probably got another 10 or 15 minutes.
Okay.
Me, so.
If you feel like you need to bounce a little early, then that's fine. And I'll take the rest of the questions myself, but that's totally up to you. I want to respect your time.
Thanks.
Okay, so Dylan asked the question, how do you respond to someone saying that we are just making assertions and not actually providing proof, evidence, argumentation for our position? Is there a difference between proof and evidence?
Okay, so 2 questions there. Yeah, there is a difference. I'll take the second one again. There is a difference between proof and evidence. Evidence is what you offer up to support a claim that you're making. The result of that, hopefully, is that you prove something. Now, the word proof can be used in less technical ways, so that it could be seen, in the same sentence. It could be used either as proof or evidence. So, technically speaking, yeah, there is a difference between them. But at the end of the day, if you're trying to offer up evidences for why Christianity is true, then the first question is relevant at that point, and which is, what do we say to people who say we're just making assertions? Well, the question is, when you've done the presentation, is that all you've done? Have you just made assertions? And if that's the case, then they're right. Okay.
Sure.
But Presup as a process, as an approach to apologetics, you have to make claims first before you can defend them. And you have to make sure that you're not going to make a claim that you can't at some point come around to and defend, or you're going to get this kind of response. And that is, I hear you making all of these assertions, but you're not showing me any evidence. Again, the question of, well, what do you mean by evidence? What do you mean by proof? Is your particular view of evidence here appropriate to the kind of thing that I'm trying to prove to you based on the nature of that thing? Kind of what we were talking about before.
Yeah. And I also think that part of, so when we say, for example, let's use in kind of the popular terminology. So the proof for the truth of the Christian worldview is that if it were not true, you couldn't prove anything at all. Let's take that kind of informal way of presenting it. Someone says, well, that's just an assertion. Well, wait a second. There's an argument in there. And part of the demonstration is the invitation of the unbeliever to provide a basis for knowledge. Because part of our argument is, if you don't adopt the Christian worldview, you can't have a foundation for those things. So part of our demonstration is your inability not to provide those foundations as the unbeliever. That's part of it. So there is an argument there, and we're presenting partial evidence. It's indirect, but I think it is, in a sense, an evidence of what we're getting at. But of course, as you said, there's a lot more to unpack. We don't just get away with, say, for example, I do not prove the truth of the Christian worldview transcendentally merely by showing the unbeliever's inability to ground knowledge, logic, or whatever. It's not,
right.
It's not that, to show that someone else's view is false doesn't automatically make my view true. There does need to be more unpacking there. And I think presuppositionalists need to do a better job in providing that part of the cake, so to speak.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. Let's move quickly here. Okay. There's, okay. Here's another quote. Patrick gives us another quote. I think I know where this quote came from. You don't need religion to have morals. If you can't determine right from wrong, then you lack empathy, not religion.
Mm-hmm. Well, in one sense, of course, you don't need religion to have morals. But if by morals you mean the common understanding of, this is my set of things that I think ought to be a certain way, and if it's not that way, or if somebody does something that's not consistent with that ought, then they're being immoral. The argument that we as Christians should be making is not that you've got to have God to have morals. You need to be more specific with what you're saying, sure. Right? The fact that there are lots and lots of different standards of morality out there, subjective ones, culturally sure. based, doesn't mean there isn't a universal, absolute type of moral code that a lawgiver has given. The existence of all the copycats or whatever does not mean there is not an original, or right. there is not an actual absolute one. So it's important to distinguish between, when you say, I have morality. Well, what are you talking about? Are you talking about you have your own personal moral code, or you're abiding by the moral code of the society that you live in? Well, yeah, you don't need religion to have that, but what you specifically need Christianity for is to have any reason to hold to that, or to try and convince somebody else that they ought to be following it. In other words, the oughtness of morality is the key to that discussion, not just the existence of multiple moral codes.
All right, very good. Here's another one from Patrick. Science adjusts its views based on what's observed. Faith is a denial of observation so that belief can be preserved. By Tim Minchin.
Yeah, Bonson would use this phrase where he would say that's more autobiographical than anything else. In other words, it's an opinion. I'm not disputing that science as a methodology. I'm not going to disagree. I mean, if it's properly practiced, then it does. It refines. Your conclusion is refined by the more instances of supporting data that you have, the more experiments that you run that seem to demonstrate that your theory is correct. You have more warrant from a scientific perspective to believe that. It doesn't mean it's true. It just means that according to the scientific method,
sure,
there is good reason to believe it's true. Okay.
Sure. Oh, your camera turned off.
My camera died. Okay. This may be the end. I'll keep talking to you. Can you hear me okay still?
Yeah, you're fine. But by the way, it's not a big deal. When I had Scott Oliphant on, the entire interview was just my face and this little circle. So you're good.
Okay. Okay. Now I'll flip it back on just in case and see if it comes back. But otherwise I'll just,
okay.
I'll
no
keep
worries. Yeah. If the audio is important, that's all.
Yeah. Faith is the denial of observation. No, I don't believe that's an appropriate way to cast that, especially when we're talking about faith in God. I would argue at the end of the day, every person's belief system or worldview is accepted on faith. And the same thing with Christians. Ultimately, we are accepting the content of the Christian worldview on the authority of God, who revealed it to us. That doesn't mean that we can't then come back around and make this argument, the transcendental argument, for instance, that then demonstrates that those faith commitments we started with are in fact correct. It just, you have to clarify what you mean by faith. You have to clarify what you mean by belief, those types of things. So I understand.
I think that's important. You're pointing out the clarification of terms, because I think a lot of Christians are quick to respond to these little snippets, and we're responding to statements that they don't have clearly defined terms.
Right.
And we want to be very careful of that. You said that multiple times about, well, it depends what he means by that. And I think that's such an important qualifier. I think we need to learn to not be so quick to jump on these comments when the comments or quotes are not sufficiently defining their terms in the first place.
Yeah, that's why these conversations take a long time if they're done,
right,
properly. Presenting the gospel doesn't have to take a long time, but if you're going to get into the apologetic aspect of it, then it's going to take time.
Absolutely. All right, thank you. Nate Werner asked the question: what was the best way to get better at what was the best way? What is the best way? I think what is the best way and what was the best way, they're both the same. So So what was the best way to get better at using Presup? Obviously, it's going to take practice, but can you role play with more experienced apologists?
I would say that's not necessarily always going to work, because a person can be a very good apologist for their beliefs, but not necessarily be good at playing devil's advocate.
Yes.
I think it's good to be able to do that. I think there's it's a great exercise to try and defend somebody else's beliefs sometimes. But certainly finding somebody who's willing to role play with you and is actually good at it and doesn't just throw out silly, responses or whatever. That is one approach to it. For me, the way I learned the most was just hard knocks, was going in and making bold claims and getting knocked down and going back and thinking about it and then coming back and just really sticking with it.
That's great because a lot of people skip over this. He says, what is the best way to get better at using Presup? Obviously, it's going to take practice.
Yes.
But can you do this other thing? Well, wait a minute. Let's go back. That going to take practice is the biggest part. How do you get better at using Presup? Is using Presup and falling flat on your face and getting up and using it again, and each time getting better at it.
Yep.
Yeah. When I had my discussion a while back with the atheist Tom Jump, I had a friend of mine, Braxton Hunter, over at Trinity Radio, who is not a Calvinist and not a presuppositionalist. He's a classicalist, but he's a good apologist, very logical guy, and he helped role play with me. So role playing is actually a helpful tool if you can get the right person for it. So the good thing about role playing with Braxton is that he wasn't a presuppositionalist, so he wasn't already open to the way that I argue. So I was able to get kind of good questions that someone who doesn't agree with me would ask. And so I think that helped me in the discussion. And I thought the discussion with Tom Jump went very well. I got a lot of positive feedback from it. And a majority of the way I prepared for that was just role playing. So that is definitely a good way to get a little bit of practice. Okay. Yep. All right. Yep. Good question here. Dylan McPhee asks, does R.C. Sproul have a distinct classical apologetic since he believes in total depravity? He even said the point of apologetics is to shut the mouth of the obstreperous or the obstreper. And Van Til agrees, right?
I think Dylan is asking if because RC and Van Til said the same thing and had the same goal, is there really a difference in their apologetic method?
Yeah,
I think that's what he's asking.
Yeah.
And the answer is yes. A really good resource is the discussion between Bahnsen and Sproul about apologetic methodology. Sure. If you listen to that, you'll hear the issues that Sproul took with Bahnsen on Presup and the impossibility of the contrary and those types of things. So yeah, I think we can share beliefs and end goals and even the intermediate goals of shutting the mouth of that word I've never heard before, by the way.
Obstreper?
Obstreper.
I guess he's referring to someone who's obstreperous.
So even though our goal is the same, it doesn't mean the approach that we take is the same approach, even if there are things that we will do in common. Like we're both going to quote scripture, hopefully.
Right. Right. They did have different, as Calvinists, obviously they were in agreement, but I guess Bahnsen would probably argue that his classical approach is inconsistent with his Calvinistic convictions.
Exactly.
Now,
That's exactly what he argues.
Right. Yep. And by the way, that discussion between Dr. Bahnsen and R.C. Sproul is available for free on Sermon Audio. So if you go on Sermon Audio, you download the app, there is the Bahnsen Project. You could type in Bahnsen Project, and Covenant Media has sold the rights to all of Dr. Bahnsen's lectures, and they're all made available for free on Sermon Audio. So that debate is available, and it is very, very good. You can see the differences laid out there wonderfully. All right. Team Taco Slick asks, what do you suggest as a curriculum to teach high school or junior high or high school kids?
Well, obviously the Bible, Taco.
Yes, it's a good curriculum.
Sorry, I had to. That's a really good question. I'm sure they're out there. I can't give you the names of any of them, though.
Yeah. Neither. I'm a teacher and I teach middle school, high school. Right. And a lot of the curriculum comes from a classical and evidentialist approach. So because I have background in apologetic and theological studies, I kind of just wing it and teach the content, putting it within a presuppositional context. So right. I don't know of any particular curriculum, but as I said before at the beginning, that I was going to have Dr. Michael Licona on. There's nothing wrong with taking what evidentialists and classicalists have written and just cater it to a consistently presuppositional approach. Unless you're going to write a curriculum yourself, get a firm grasp on presuppositionalism and contextualize. I think that's a good way. That's what I've done when I taught middle school and high school students. All right. Okay. So let's see here. We're moving along quickly. There we go. The Sire asks, what do you think about non-Calvinists being presuppositionalists? Do you think that Reformed theology is necessary to the method or as a commitment? Now, I don't know if you're aware, but there are some non-Reformed presuppositionalists. One comes to mind, Jay Dyer, who is, I think he's Eastern Orthodox, and he is known for using presuppositional approach, transcendental argumentation. What's your view on that?
I think you can reason and argue presuppositionally, regardless of whether you're a Calvinist or not. The question is, are you going to be successful? We talked about that before. in using that approach. Thinking presuppositionally, indirectly, trying to figure out what the presuppositions are that make this thing intelligible. That's a way of reasoning and a way of thinking that works with anything, essentially. But I think the consistent presuppositionalist, from a Christian presuppositionalist perspective, I think Reformed theology, there's a reason it came out of that camp, right?
So are you saying if you want to be an inconsistent presuppositionalist, sure, have at it. You don't have to be Reformed. But if you want to be consistent, you need to be Reformed. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay.
And that doesn't mean you won't be successful
Yeah.
not being a Reformed presupper.
Right.
But the question is, why would you not want to?
Right. Well, Van Til most certainly thought you needed to be Reformed because part of his project was to derive an apologetic methodology that flows out of a consistent Reformed perspective. So I would say yes, and I would agree with Brian that if you're going to be a little inconsistent, you could still make headway. And as we always are apt to say, God can strike a blow with a broken stick. Right? We're not always consistent, but God can still use our how can I say this? He can use broken people. There we go. Okay, so this is a good one. When should a presuppositionalist shake the dust from their feet? When do we call it quits and be like, I've had enough of you? Yeah,
I think that's whenever you think it's time. I mean, seriously, it's going to be different for every person and every conversation that you're having. I think there are what would be to me a fairly good indicator is that you're hearing the same thing from them over and over, even though you've addressed it. Mm-hmm. And whether, if they're being dense on purpose, if they're not being genuine in their discussion with you, then I would call that out. And if it doesn't change, then it's like, why do I, I'll pray for you. I can't. Right. It doesn't make sense. There's, I can sit here and read scripture to you and would love to do that, but they're probably not going to stick around for that. So,
right.
So it depends. I hate to say it that way, but it really depends.
Yeah.
And
it's not like in 5 minutes, if he, at 5 minutes and 42 seconds, if he doesn't accept your argument, then shake the dust of it. There's no really one set answer for that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, Dylan McPhee says, in what way do presuppers utilize evidences? Are we assuming the non-believer can understand the reasons we are giving them, even though it's not in the context of climbing up to God?
All right, let me think. Let me make sure I'm getting this. I believe it's acceptable to assume that non-believers can understand our reasoning and our evidences, but that's because they live in the world that God has created, right? And so that's how we as a presupper would use evidence. We're not just going to lay the evidence out there and not talk about the nature of evidence and why we can do the scientific method in the first place. Again, it comes down to each individual person you're talking with and how much time you have and what they're willing to listen to. But that's going to be the main difference between a presupper. In fact, I just picked up a copy or just found an older copy of a Van Til book about evidences, presuppositionalism and evidences. I don't remember the exact title, but both Bahnsen and Van Til give great examples in their writing of how you go about doing that.
All right, this one's a fun one. David Julius asks, when are you becoming a Catholic?
Who's that directed to? Is that directed to you, Eli?
Well, I would assume that you're the guest. So I mean, I'm never becoming a Catholic. I'm fully convinced that Catholicism is not correct. So I'm a bloodthirsty Protestant. So
I don't know if the reason for that question is because they know that I'm currently meeting on a regular basis, talking with a Catholic friend of mine, sure. Or maybe it's because they know a lot of people who are apologists who've become Catholic. I'm in the same boat as you. I don't foresee that happening ever.
Yeah. Dennis McCullen, there we go. How much did Gene Cook's Narrow Mind podcast influence you?
Not saying that it's not a good podcast. It's just, it didn't influence me because I didn't happen to listen to it much. Maybe once.
I did happen to listen to him later on, like last year, and it was really good. But I mean, when I got started, I didn't even know who Gene Cook was. Yeah. All right. We're almost through. You're doing excellent job, by the way. Here is a question from our local atheist, agnostic, however Doug would like to refer to himself as. But Doug, otherwise known as Pine Creek, asks about Thomas Edison. Oh no, is that? Wait a minute. Okay, I saw him before. I wonder if I got the right one here. So Brian Knapp says, "I want to know if it was him who said it. Do you ask the question of Jesus and the things he said in the Gospel of John?"
Well, I think he's saying, would I ask the same question that I asked about Edison? Would I ask that same question about Jesus? Did Jesus actually say that?
Right.
No. And that's because it's in Scripture, and I believe God's word is infallible. And if the Bible says that Jesus is talking, then I accept that on the authority of God's word. Also, an important point is that when I said I'd really be curious if Edison said that, it wasn't a red herring, or I wasn't trying to get out of answering the question. I'm pretty sure I went ahead and answered it after that. It was just speaking more to the time that we live in, where all sorts of different quotes show up on the web, ascribed to people who never said those things.
All right.
So it was more of a curiosity for me. I just wonder if he actually said that. So.
Right. Gotcha. All right. Thank you for that. Let's see here. A couple of funny ones. I'll avoid posting those here. Okay. Here's a question. This is the last one, I think. Okay, good. I think that's the last one. I didn't skip anything. Let me see here.
That's a good question, Scott. I'm no longer involved with Choosing Hats. I think Chris might be still, or have the ability to contribute, but there are other areas that I'm involved in, that I'm spending my time in. So I hate to say it, but I don't think I've looked at Choosing Hats for quite a while.
Yeah. So. Chris Bolt's series, where he kind of summarizes all of the main points of presuppositionalism, I think are excellent. So even though they might not be posting new stuff, the old stuff that's on there is really good. So you should definitely check out Choosing Hats. That was the last question. I do apologize. I think my comment stream kind of zoomed up and I might have skipped a bunch, but I don't want to waste a bunch of airtime scrolling through again. So I do apologize if we didn't get to your question. But Brian, I think you did an excellent job. And someone says I didn't know what. I'm trying to look here. I'm so sorry if I missed a question. Oh my goodness. I'm so sorry if I missed it. It's definitely difficult to follow the comments here. Let's see here if I can just get the last one. I said no, I can't find it. There's just too much. Okay, well, here's a nice one you might like here. Oh, well, this is very nice. Thank you, Scott. Scott says, the pop Presup community desperately needs leaders like Eli and the old Choosing Hats site. I'm telling you, Choosing Hats really cool, man. I wish you guys were making stuff, but unfortunately, it is what it is, right?
Right. Yep.
And Team Taco Slick says, great guest, Eli. I agree, Brian. You did a good job. And Pine Creek, one last little jab. I always miss questions unintentionally. Yeah, it's true. I'm using StreamYard, and so sometimes the new questions will come up, and when I'm scrolling down, it'll like jump all the way to the bottom, and so I don't want to waste time just going through. So I do apologize. You guys do know I spend a lot of time answering questions. I do try to get to all of them, so I do apologize if I missed it here. Let me see here. Okay, there's one last question here. Let's take this last one here because I think this person, Slam RN, posted a question and I missed it. So I'll throw a bone here. Okay. So question for Brian. Do you find that the hardest thing about using Presup is getting the other person to accept your premises? Would you even call them premises when we give kind of a transcendental sort of argument?
Yes. That is the hardest part. I would change it a little bit by saying the hardest thing about using it is getting them to understand why I'm approaching this question the way I am. Mm-hmm. And so whether it's the way I'm presenting my premises or just the way I'm arguing in the first place is very different for people, I think, generally. And so I spend a lot of time explaining why, based on the nature of what it is you're asking me to do and the questions you want me to answer, here's the way I'm going to approach it, and here's why. I want to make sure that they understand why I'm approaching it the way I am. Because if they don't ever buy into that, then it doesn't matter how good a job I do with my presentation. If they haven't bought into the approach I'm going to use, if they're not going to at least hear me out for the sake of argument, then yeah. And there have been people who don't want anything to do with that particular approach. And so I've not been successful with them.
Yeah. But you also mentioned before, you see, the nature of the transcendental argumentation is that you can take something that you both agree upon. So you can take for, any X, right? Phil, X can be any truth that is just a given for, both of you. So you can take any item of human experience, right? And then just ask what are the necessary preconditions for those experiences, and then lay out the worldview perspectives, right? So you basically, so that's what a transcendental argument basically, says, X is the case, or I'm sorry, let me see, how can I put this out?
Well, not everybody's going to let you get away with that, I guess is what I would say to that, right? You can ask that question, but there will be those people who are like, look, I asked you a simple question. Why do you believe the Bible's true? Why are you asking me about what I believe? Right.
Yeah.
So, but you're right. That would be how I would proceed with a transcendental argument, is give me that given. And then in order for that given to be what it is, Christianity must be true. Yeah. You must presuppose it in order to consistently call that a given, or call it whatever it is. And that's the key. Maybe another time we can talk more about the consistency part of it.
Yeah. All right. Very good. This is got a couple more here. These are fun ones. I know we're going to end, but not that one. Let me see here. How has Knapp studied Presup for so long without losing any hair? That's true. I mean, look at James White. James White lost hair. I mean, I was just watching an old video
Poor
of him.
guy.
Yeah. But this is a good one, and maybe we can make this happen. I think it'd be fun. Eli, have you ever thought about having the choosing hats guys for a round table? I'd love to get you, Chris, and some of the old gang together for a nice little super duper Presup episode. Maybe we can make that happen. I know Chris loves
I'd be up for it.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, cool. Well, we'll try to make that happen here. Let's see here. Round table. Chris says that sounds circular. Ha ha ha. Very good. Saw what you did there. Bring on Michael Butler. I wish. He's missing in action. We have no idea where he is. Okay.
Interesting note, when I did take some classes through Bonson Theological Seminary, BTS, and Michael was my, I don't know what they call him, mentor or whatever. You're listening to tapes and reading material, and then you go meet with your teacher, not teacher. And I, he was, I'm up in the Alexandria, Virginia area. He was in Lynchburg at the time, which is, only 4 hours away. So I drove down, and a friend of mine, actually the fellow who got me into Presup, and I drove down, and we went over and met with him.
I wonder why he doesn't do any apology. I mean, it's not.
I've lost track of him as well.
Yeah. Well, everyone has. Which I think is interesting. But at any rate, Brian, this was a great discussion. I really appreciated what you had to say, and I'd love to get you, Chris, and everyone else who used to contribute to Choosing Hats and do kind of I don't know how many people in all contributed.
Oh, the total there were probably 5 or 6, but there were maybe 3 constant. The 3 that probably actually only 2 constant ones. Chris. And Razor's Kiss is his handle.
Yeah, maybe we can get you guys on. We'll have a fun discussion. We'll pick like a specific topic to address that's related, and I think that'd be a lot of fun. But are there any last things you'd like to say? I really do appreciate you coming on. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, just thank you for the opportunity. It was very laid back. This is I've been approached to do debates, and I really wanted to do the one with David, and I just found I didn't have the time to prepare. Yeah. Obviously, I don't know enough about classical foundationalism, for instance, to feel comfortable going into a debate on that. But yeah, I really enjoyed this kind of interactive, relaxed, just discussion, and totally up for it again. So
nice. Awesome. I'd love to have you back on again. Yeah. It doesn't have the stress of debates. I would like to do more debates myself. It's just, again, I have 3 kids, got a job, got a family. Debates take a lot of prep, and stuff like this, like all my shows, I don't prep at all for. I just I have enough background where I can interview and ask questions and things like that. So I'm sticking with this format for now, but hopefully when my schedule opens up a bit, I'll start doing some more debates, because I know a lot of people want to see the presuppositional apologetic methodology actually used, so they can kind of see. For me, I learned through debates a lot more than discussions. I like to see how these ideas kind of interact, right? Like in the heat of the moment. So, so hopefully that will happen in the future. And if you do have your discussion with David, I'd love to see that as well. I'm sure it'd be a great joy to see you guys interact. So, cool. All right, well, that's it for today. Thank you so much, Brian, for coming on, and we will definitely have him back on. Hopefully we can get the old gang together from Choosing Hats. But until then, stay tuned for our upcoming video or interview with Michael Preciado and Scarlett Clay, I think her name is. Totally bad. I don't have anything in front of me, but those should be some interesting discussions coming up. And I appreciate everyone who is listening, who has supported Revealed Apologetics with just being present and throwing questions in here and there. Greatly, greatly appreciate it, guys. Well, that's it for this live. I can't even close. This is the most awkward closing.
Time for bed, Eli.
It's time for bed. Just look at this. I have no more coffee. It's gone. And I was going to drink water while you were saying something like there's no more water. So I'm a lost cause. Well, that's it. If you like the content, please share, subscribe if you haven't. And thank you very much. Take care. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thanks.